October 1971. 400 feet beneath the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, deep inside Soviet territorial waters, two U.S. Navy divers clung to a 5-inch wide cable on the ocean floor, their fingers numb inside thick gloves, breathing a helium-oxygen mixture that made every breath feel like inhaling razor blades. They had maybe 30 minutes before the cold would kill them. Above, a nuclear submarine hovered in total darkness, its hull creaking under 12 atmospheres of pressure. One mistake, one sound, and the Soviet Navy's entire Pacific Fleet would descend on their position. What were they doing there? Installing what would become the most successful espionage device in Cold War history, a wiretap that would operate undetected for an entire decade, recording thousands of Soviet military conversations. But here's the part that defies belief. They weren't cutting the cable. They weren't piercing it. They weren't even touching the wires inside. The engineering challenge was impossible. Tap an underwater communications cable without the Soviets ever knowing it existed, at depths that would crush an ordinary submarine, in waters patrolled by the most paranoid Navy on Earth, and retrieve the recordings every single month for 10 years without being caught. This is the story of Operation Ivy Bells, not the spy thriller version, but the real engineering miracle that made it possible.
Let's understand exactly what the United States Navy was up against in 1970. Captain James Bradley, Chief of Naval Undersea Intelligence and a World War II submarine veteran, had learned through intelligence sources about an undersea communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk. This cable connected Petropavlovsk, the Soviet Pacific Fleet's primary nuclear submarine base on the Kamchatka Peninsula, with the mainland headquarters at Vladivostok, over 600 miles away. Think about what that cable represented. Every order to Soviet ballistic missile submarines, every communication about nuclear first strike capability, every discussion about ICBM tests, all flowing through one physical wire at the bottom of the ocean. Bradley's brilliant insight came from an unexpected place. In the United States, underwater cables near shorelines were marked with signs reading, "Do not anchor, cable here." He reasoned the Soviets would do the same thing, and he was right. A reconnaissance submarine using its periscope spotted warning signs on both the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Soviet mainland, essentially advertising exactly where the cable entered the sea. But knowing where the cable was and actually tapping it were two completely different engineering challenges. Challenge number 1, location. The Sea of Okhotsk wasn't just Soviet territorial waters. The Soviets claimed the entire sea as their exclusive domain. They had installed a network of sound detection devices across the seabed to detect intruders. Soviet surface ships and submarines conducted constant exercises. This was their backyard, and they guarded it ferociously. Challenge number 2, depth. The cable lay 400 feet down. At that depth, water pressure reaches over 12 times atmospheric pressure, approximately 173 pounds per square inch. That's enough to crush human lungs like aluminum cans. Standard scuba equipment becomes lethal. Nitrogen narcosis would render divers unconscious within minutes. Challenge number 3, the tap itself. Soviet engineers weren't fools. If the cable was cut or damaged, alarms would trigger immediately in Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. Repair crews would scramble. The tap would be discovered before it recorded a single conversation. The device had to wrap around the cable, detect the electromagnetic signals passing through the copper wire inside, and record everything, all without physically piercing the protective casing. Challenge number 4, temperature. The Sea of Okhotsk is one of the coldest bodies of water on Earth. Even in summer, bottom temperatures hover just above freezing. Hypothermia would kill a diver in 20 minutes. Equipment would fail, batteries would drain, recording devices would freeze solid. Challenge number 5, monthly retrieval. A recording device could only store so much data. The tapes would need to be swapped every 30 days. That meant returning to the exact same location in hostile waters with Soviet detection systems active 12 times per year for years without ever being caught. The engineering consensus? Impossible. But Captain Bradley believed it could be done, and he knew exactly which submarine could do it.
The USS Halibut was unlike any submarine in the United States Navy. Originally designed in the late 1950s as a nuclear-powered guided missile platform carrying Regulus cruise missiles, Halibut had already proven herself on impossible missions. In 1968, she had located the wreck of the Soviet submarine K-129 in the Pacific Ocean, a technological marvel that involved searching 17,000 feet of ocean floor for a single submarine. For Operation Ivy Bells, Halibut underwent extensive modifications. The former missile hangar, a massive space that once housed 5 Regulus missiles, was converted into what the crew called the Bat Cave, a specialized chamber for launching remotely operated vehicles and deploying saturation divers. The engineering was extraordinary. A decompression chamber was installed, allowing divers to live for days under pressure before and after deep dives. Skids were welded to the submarine's underside, enabling Halibut to settle gently on the ocean floor without damaging her hull or making excessive noise. The submarine was equipped with a remotely operated vehicle nicknamed the Fish, a camera-equipped ROV that could search the seabed while Halibut maintained a safer depth. Advanced sonar systems could map the ocean floor in total darkness. A 24-bit mainframe computer, cutting edge for 1971, processed navigation data and controlled the ROV. But the most critical modification involved funding. The Navy secretly diverted money from the Deep Submergence Rescue Program. To explain why Halibut had large cylindrical objects attached to her hull, fake DSRV simulators were installed as cover. These were actually the diver lockout chambers. The crew was told nothing. Security clearances didn't extend to the actual mission. Sailors below a certain rank believed they were searching for debris from Soviet SSN-12 sandbox anti-ship missiles, which, remarkably, they actually did find and recover during the mission as a brilliant cover story. They retrieved over 2 million pieces of missile debris, the largest no bigger than 6 inches, and successfully reverse-engineered a complete SSN-12 back in the United States. But the real mission remained invisible to most of the crew. The divers faced a physiological problem that had killed men before. At 400 feet, standard compressed air becomes toxic. Nitrogen narcosis creates a drunk-like state called rapture of the deep. Divers lose judgment, remove their regulators, or swim deeper thinking they're ascending. Oxygen itself becomes poisonous under pressure, causing convulsions and unconsciousness. The solution was saturation diving with helium-oxygen mixture, technology that was still experimental in the early 1970s. Here's how it worked. Human body tissues absorb inert gases under pressure. Normally, divers decompress slowly during ascent to allow nitrogen to safely leave their bloodstream. But at 400 feet, that decompression would take days. Saturation diving embraced a radical principle. If you keep divers under pressure for extended periods, their tissues become fully saturated with helium. They can work at depth for hours or days and then decompress once at the end. The Navy's Mark 11 saturation diving system installed on Halibut regulated pressure precisely, maintained backup gas supplies, and monitored every physiological parameter.
Divers lived in the pressurized chamber for days before the mission, their bodies slowly saturating with helium at 12 atmospheres of pressure. The gas mixture was carefully calibrated, roughly 10% oxygen, 90% helium. Too much oxygen would cause toxicity, too little would mean death. The helium prevented nitrogen narcosis, but created its own challenges. Helium conducts heat 20 times faster than air. Divers would freeze in minutes without electrically heated suits. Helium also changed their voices to high-pitched squeaks, making communication difficult and adding surreal absurdity to an already terrifying mission. The dive profile was meticulously planned. Exit through the Batcave lockout chamber, tethered to Halibut by umbilical cords supplying gas and heat. Work in shifts to prevent hypothermia. Install the tap. Return to the chamber. The margin for error was zero. But what would they actually install? That required solving an engineering problem that shouldn't have had a solution.
The cable tap was a masterpiece of Cold War engineering, designed by AT&T's Bell Laboratories, the same institution that invented the transistor and the laser. The device measured 20 feet long and weighed 6 tons. It had to accomplish something that seemed physically impossible: detect electrical signals inside a shielded cable without breaking the cable's protective casing. The solution exploited a principle of physics. When electrical current flows through a conductor, it generates an electromagnetic field around the wire, even inside shielded cables, even underwater. The field is weak, but it exists. Bell Labs engineers designed inductive sensors that could detect these fields with extraordinary sensitivity. The tap wrapped around the Soviet cable like a clamshell. Sensors positioned at precise intervals measured the electromagnetic pulses representing phone conversations and teletype transmissions. Inside the device, recording equipment captured everything on magnetic tape. The entire system was waterproofed and pressure-resistant to 400 feet. But here's the engineering elegance that made it brilliant. If Soviet crews raised the cable for maintenance, the tap was designed to detach automatically and sink to the ocean floor. It wouldn't remain attached and reveal its existence. The Soviets would see nothing unusual, just a normal cable. Power was another challenge. Batteries at that depth, at freezing temperatures, would fail quickly. The solution came from nuclear technology. Later versions of the tap were powered by radioisotope thermoelectric generators, the same power source used on deep space probes. Radioactive decay generated heat, which was converted to electricity. These advanced taps could operate for an entire year without maintenance. The first-generation tap, installed in October 1971, required monthly servicing. Every 30 days, divers would exit Halibut, locate the tap, retrieve the recording tapes, and install fresh ones. The tapes were then shipped to the National Security Agency for processing and dissemination to U.S. intelligence agencies. And what did those tapes reveal? The first recordings from the tap astonished American intelligence analysts. The Soviets weren't encrypting their communications at all. Think about that. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, operating ballistic missile submarines armed with nuclear weapons, was conducting phone conversations and sending teletype messages in plain text. No codes, no ciphers, just regular Russian language conversations. Why would they be so careless? The answer reveals the Soviets' confidence in physical security. They believed undersea cables were inherently secure. Cables couldn't be intercepted like radio signals. They ran through the ocean floor in waters patrolled by their own navy. The idea that an American submarine could penetrate the Sea of Okhotsk, locate a 5-inch cable in thousands of square miles of ocean, and install a tap at 400 feet depth seemed impossible. And for 99.9% of submarines in existence, it was impossible.
but not for Halibut. The intelligence harvest was extraordinary. Conversations between senior Soviet officers revealed naval operations at Petropavlovsk, the primary base for Yankee-class and Delta-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines. American analysts learned Soviet patrol patterns, maintenance schedules, missile test procedures, and nuclear submarine deployment strategies. The information provided insight into Soviet nuclear first strike capabilities and ICBM testing. It revealed weaknesses in Soviet communication security and operational procedures. Perhaps most importantly, it gave American leaders confidence that they understood Soviet strategic intentions, reducing the risk of miscalculation during the tense Cold War period. Operation Ivy Bells expanded. More taps were installed on Soviet communication lines in other parts of the world. Other submarines joined the mission: USS Parche, USS Richard B. Russell, and USS Seawolf. When Halibut was decommissioned in 1976, these submarines continued the courier missions. Each submarine conducted multiple missions per year. By some estimates, the United States carried out as many as 2,000 submarine missions into Soviet territorial waters during the Cold War. The operation ran flawlessly. Month after month, year after year, American submarines returned to the Sea of Okhotsk, swapped the tapes, and extracted priceless intelligence. The Soviets suspected nothing. And then, in January 1980, everything changed. Ronald Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. on January 14, 1980, with only a few $100s in his bank account and $65,000 in debt. Pelton was a 44-year-old veteran analyst at the National Security Agency, fluent in Russian, with 14 years of access to America's most sensitive intelligence programs. He had filed for bankruptcy 3 months earlier. He had resigned from the NSA. He was desperate. And he had an extraordinary photographic memory. Pelton offered to sell what he knew to the KGB for money. He carried no documents, too risky. But he didn't need documents. He could describe NSA operations in precise detail from memory. Over the next 3 years, from 1980 to 1983, Pelton met with KGB handlers and revealed American intelligence programs. For information about Operation Ivy Bells specifically, the KGB paid him $5,000. For everything he revealed, he received a total of $35,000, a fraction of his debt, and an infinitesimal sum compared to the damage he caused. The Soviets didn't act immediately. That would have revealed their source. Instead, they waited until 1981. Then, U.S. surveillance satellites observed Soviet warships, including a salvage vessel, anchored directly over the site of the cable tap in the Sea of Okhotsk. The USS Parche was dispatched to recover the device before the Soviets could retrieve it. The divers searched the location. The tap was gone. The Soviets had the tap. They analyzed it. They understood exactly what the United States had been doing for an entire decade. As of 1999, the recovered cable tap was on public display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow, a trophy of Soviet counterintelligence. But how was Pelton caught? In August 1985, a KGB colonel named Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the United States. During his debriefing, Yurchenko recalled meeting with a red-haired former NSA analyst who had walked into the Soviet embassy years earlier. He couldn't remember the name, but he remembered the details. The FBI investigated. They narrowed the possibilities. On November 25, 1985, they arrested Ronald Pelton at a hotel in Annapolis, Maryland. Pelton was convicted in 1986 of espionage and sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms plus 10 years. He served nearly 30 years in federal prison before being released on November 24, 2015. He died on September 6, 2022, at age 80. For $5,000, he had ended the most successful espionage operation in Cold War history.
Operation Ivy Bells represents a specific type of engineering brilliance, the kind that solves problems everyone agrees are impossible. Consider what was accomplished. A submarine designed in the 1950s, modified with 1970s technology, repeatedly penetrated Soviet territorial waters undetected. Divers working at depths that would kill most people installed sophisticated electronic devices on a cable the width of a coffee can. The tap recorded conversations without physically connecting to the cable. The operation continued for a decade with monthly tape swaps, and the Soviets never suspected anything until a traitor revealed it. Every component required breakthrough engineering. The saturation diving system pushed the limits of human physiology. The inductive tap exploited electromagnetic principles with precision that seemed impossible given the technology of the time. The submarine modifications created capabilities that technically shouldn't have fit in a single vessel. The navigation and positioning required mathematical precision in an era before GPS. The operation influenced modern submarine design and special operations capabilities. The techniques developed for Ivy Bells evolved into current undersea intelligence gathering methods. Saturation diving became standard in commercial deep-sea operations, offshore oil platforms, and submarine rescue missions. The inductive tapping principle informed modern electronic surveillance technology. But perhaps the most important lesson is strategic. Operation Ivy Bells succeeded because the Soviets considered it impossible. They assessed the threat based on typical submarine capabilities, not exceptional ones. They trusted physical security, the depth, the cold, the distance, the defenses, without considering that those obstacles could be overcome through engineering innovation. Modern undersea cables carry 99% of international internet traffic and financial transactions. Those cables remain vulnerable to the same principles that made Ivy Bells possible. Countries with advanced submarine capabilities, not just the United States, but Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and others, possess the technology to repeat similar operations today with far more sophisticated equipment. The difference is that modern cables are fiber optic, not copper wire. Tapping them requires different technology, optical splitters that divert a fraction of the light signal without disrupting transmission. But the operational challenge remains the same. Reach the cable undetected, install a device that the owners don't notice, and extract intelligence without revealing your presence. That's why Operation Ivy Bells remains classified in many details even 50 years later. The core engineering principles haven't changed. The vulnerabilities haven't changed. Only the technology has improved.
400 feet beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, in water cold enough to kill in minutes, under pressure that crushes steel, 2 divers installed a 20-foot-long tap on a Soviet communication cable and changed the course of the Cold War. The engineering achievement remains extraordinary, not because it required impossible technology, but because it required perfect integration of existing technologies pushed to their absolute limits. Submarine design, saturation diving, electromagnetic sensors, nuclear power sources, navigation, all combined in a single operation that had to work flawlessly, repeatedly, for 10 years. It worked until human betrayal ended it, not engineering failure, not Soviet detection, not equipment malfunction. A man with a photographic memory and mounting debts walked into an embassy and sold the secret for $5,000. But the technical brilliance of Operation Ivy Bells proved something fundamental about problem solving. Impossible is usually just expensive, dangerous, and complicated. With sufficient engineering skill, careful planning, and extraordinary execution, the impossible becomes merely difficult. The cable tap from Ivy Bells sits in a Moscow museum today. The divers who installed it never received public recognition. The submarine crews believed they were searching for missile debris. The full operational details remain classified, but the engineering principles demonstrated in that operation continue to influence underwater technology, special operations, and intelligence gathering today. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into military engineering challenges that shouldn't have been solvable. Next time, we're exploring how British engineers constructed a functional harbor on the beaches of Normandy in just 14 days, a construction project that many engineers called more impossible than the invasion itself. Hit that subscribe button. And remember, the next time someone tells you something can't be done, think about the engineers who put a wiretap on the Soviet Navy's phone line at the bottom of the ocean for 10 years, undetected. They proved that with enough engineering brilliance, impossible is just the starting point.